Desperate to secure a grade 9 in your Anita and Me GCSE English Literature comparison question? Well, you're in the right place. I'm going to show you exactly what you need to do to get full marks. So stay tuned and watch Schofield on Shakespeare.
We're gonna build a palace and we'll be so proud. A palace where the roar of the crowd will tell the world our palace will last forever.
You can skip to any of the individual sections by clicking on the hyperlinks within the YouTube box below, although I would recommend watching this short video in full. So here's the mark scheme for question 1A from the OCR GCSE English Literature Exploring Modern and Literary Heritage Texts. But of course, it's the top band, level 6, that we're really interested in. What have we got? And what does each bullet point actually mean in plain English? Well, the overview for this level is that you have a sustained critical style. How should we interpret this? Well, to some extent, this is about using the correct register, writing formally, and not ending up simply telling us what happens in the story rather than analysing the question. Your response needs to be informed and personal, so it's clear that you have a detailed understanding of the text as a whole and have developed your own ideas. You aren't just regurgitating, you are actively thinking and discovering anew each time you revisit an extract or an exam question. Your understanding of the context of the extract from Anita and Me is perceptive and sensitive. Of course, the question states that you should focus only on the extracts, and this is correct. However, in order to show a detailed understanding of the passage, you are likely to need to put the passage in its context and explain some crucial details from the novel as a whole. Let me try to give you an example of this from Anita and Me. We could be presented with an extract in which Mina is present when Sam Lowbridge ambushes a TV reporter and cries, "If you want a nigger for a neighbour, vote Labour." The narrator reveals that Mina felt as if she had been spat at, that there were gobs of bile hanging off her cheeks. However, to fully understand this reaction, we need to understand the context of the novel as a whole and what has happened previously, i.e. that one of her friends named her dog Nigger, that a sweet-looking elderly lady referred to her or her mother as a wog following a motoring incident, to name just 2 moments. By referencing the context, we can evaluate the extract and come to the conclusion that actually society contains a racist underbelly and that Sam Lowbridge's outburst is not the isolated rant of an ignorant madman, but representative of an angry racist minority. Your understanding is consistently perceptive. There are no slight misunderstandings, and you don't just state the obvious. You build upon your ideas to make more sophisticated points relevant to the question. Assessment Objective 1 requires you to use wonderfully, naturally embedded quotations. What do the best embedded quotations look like? 3 examples of sentences which use quotations are coming up. Which one is the best? Her disbelief stems from her prejudicial, stereotypical view that those from an ethnic background are likely to be barely literate, lost and already defeated, or confused, helpless innocents, and therefore implicitly inferior to herself and her family. Example 2. It is clear that Deirdre is surprised by Mina's mother's confidence and doesn't quite know what to make of them as a family. The narrator notes that the family were not one of those faceless hordes depicted in the television news, arriving at airports with baggage and children, lost and already defeated, begging for sanctuary. Example 3. Deirdre is clearly prejudiced and bigoted. The narrator observes, "We were not the barely literate, perpetually grinning idiots I occasionally saw in TV comedies." If watching this within a classroom, you might like to press pause now to discuss which example is better in terms of its use of embedded quotations. The video will resume in 5 seconds' time. Well, of course, all 3 sentences are probably fine, although this quotation is too long. It's hard to justify a 27-word quotation, especially when you consider the fact that a quotation is, by definition, words copied from the text. You actually get your marks for what you say about the quotation as much as the quotation itself. The third example is nice and clear, and I don't object per se to an introductory colon prior to the quotation, provided that you don't feel the need to do this every single time. But where's the meat, the crucial part of this quotation? Is it the "we were not," or the "I occasionally saw," or "barely literate," "perpetually grinning idiots"? These are the phrases which are worth exploring, and so I prefer the first example, in which the most interesting phrases are combed from different sections of the text and placed compellingly within the same sentence. Ensure that you go into plenty of detail when exploring language, form, and structure. Again, some examples might be helpful. Which is the better? Number 1. During the fight, Tracy dives straight into the tangle of kicking, biting, scratching bodies. This quotation suggests that the brawl is vicious and chaotic, with the girls doing anything to hurt each other. Number 2. Sile describes the first part of their fight as featuring a tangle of kicking, biting, scratching bodies. This metaphor implies that the two are closely intertwined, so much so that it is difficult to identify individual body parts of each participant. The use of asyndeton creates a frantic, breathless feel, which reflects the fight itself, whilst the two present participles, biting and scratching, suggest that the girls are resorting to primal, animalistic actions in their desperation to come out on top. And number 3. It is clearly difficult for onlookers to identify exactly what is happening within the fight. There is a tangle of kicking, biting, scratching bodies. This suggests that the bodies are incredibly closely mixed up with each other and that a great deal of pain is being experienced. As before, if watching this in the classroom, the teacher might like to press pause now to spark a vigorous discussion about the merits and otherwise of each example. Which one is best? Once again, all 3 examples are generally okay. With the first one, there is clear, concise insight into language, with the suggestion that the brawl is vicious and chaotic. Similarly, with the third one, there is detailed insight into the meaning and effects of the word tangle, although I would have preferred this to have been made more explicit. However, it is clearly the second example which is far more detailed, as partly signified by its much longer length. Rather than just explore tangle, we also have insight into the effects of the present participles, biting and scratching. The mark scheme also calls for consistently effective use of relevant subject terminology. So don't just write "this suggests" or "this shows," but be more precise, be more technical. Sile's simile suggests that, or the adjectives used are persistently negative. And finally, you need to achieve a sustained interwoven comparison of texts. In other words, you don't just talk about Anita and me in one chunk, and then the unseen text in a separate one. You compare throughout, and my own model response will give you further insight into this. Time now for an exam style question. Compare how feelings between adults are presented in these two extracts. You should consider the situations and experiences faced by the characters, how the characters react to these situations and experiences, how language and dramatic features create effects. The two extracts are about to appear on screen. Email me at schofieldonshakespeare@gmail.com if you would like an exam-style paper in PDF form so that you can refer to the extracts more easily. Extract 1 from Anita and Me by Mira Sile. In this extract, Anita's mother, Deirdre, confronts Mina's mother. Mrs. K, have you stopped your Mina seeing my Anita? Mama turned round slowly, wearing that dangerously patient expression that always made me want to slink into a corner wearing a conical hat with a D on it. Now, why should I want to do that, Mrs. Rutter? Because we ain't good enough for you lot, is that it? Mama and I both picked up Deirdre's tone, which was not one of hostility, but disbelief. She was waiting for an answer to the question that obviously deeply puzzled her and upset her. How could we possibly think ourselves better than her? I'd always been a little afraid of Deirdre with her scarlet gash of her mouth and her backhanded conversation, but now I could see something else, something unexpected in her face. She was frightened of us. Of course, it made sense. We were not one of those faceless hordes depicted in the television news, arriving at airports with baggage and children, lost and already defeated, begging for sanctuary. We were not the barely literate, perpetually grinning idiots I occasionally saw in TV comedies, or the confused, helpless innocents I spotted in bus and supermarket queues whilst they tried to make sense of their small change, or the gesticulating wanderers who would sometimes stop my papa for directions, holding up pieces of paper with Mr. Singh, Wolverhampton, England written on them. Mama and Papa charmed people. They had bought a new car. They held parties. They did not ask for approval or acceptance, but it came to them nevertheless. Deirdre had been seeking approval all her life in this village, her village, and I suppose she wanted to know why life was so bloody unfair. Extract 2 from Stoner by John Williams. William Stoner has had a disagreement with his head of department, Holly Lomax, about whether a student should be permitted to remain at their university. Stoner continued, "We've had a disagreement, but that isn't unusual. We've been friends before, and I see no reason—" "We have never been friends," Lomax said distinctly. "All right," Stoner said, "but we've got along at least. We can keep whatever differences we have, but for God's sake, there's no need to display them. Even the students are beginning to notice." "And well the students might," Lomax said bitterly, "since one of their own number nearly had his career ruined. A brilliant student whose only crimes were his imagination and enthusiasm and integrity that forced him into conflict with you. And yes, I might as well say it, an unfortunate physical affliction that would have called for sympathy in a normal human being." With his good right hand, Lomax held a pencil, and it trembled before him. Almost with horror, Stoner realized that Lomax was dreadfully and irrevocably sincere. "No," Lomax went on passionately, "for that I cannot forgive you." Stoner tried to keep his voice from becoming stiff. "It isn't a question of forgiving. It's simply a question of our behaving towards each other so that not too much discomfort is made for the students and the other members of the department." "I'm going to be very frank with you, Stoner," Lomax said. His anger had quieted, and his voice was calm, matter-of-fact. "I don't think you're fit to be a teacher. No man is whose prejudices override his talents and his learning. I should probably fire you if I had the power, but I don't have the power, as we both know. You are protected by the tenure system. I must accept that. But I don't have to play the hypocrite. I want to have nothing to do with you, nothing at all, and I will not pretend otherwise." Stoner looked at him steadily for several moments. Then he shook his head. "All right, Holly," he said tiredly. "It's now time to have a go at writing your own response. Start with a very brief introduction summing up the key feelings experienced by adults in the two extracts before launching into your first main paragraph. Remembering the importance of interwoven comparisons, you may decide to structure your response in this way. Begin by focusing on the question. Don't fall into the trap of narrating what happens in the extract. Instead, start your paragraph by answering the question and using keywords such as adults and/or feelings. But don't be too general, and so this is where the embedded quotations come in. They help you show the examiner that you have a detailed understanding of the passage. After quoting, add to your original point about the feelings of the adults. Develop it, perhaps by referring to some detail within your quotation. Next, it's time to whiz across to the other text and make your first comparison. Remember, this can be a similarity or a difference. That doesn't really matter. However, it needs to be reasonably specific. So don't just say in a different way or similarly, but actually say how the adult feelings are similar or different. Next, it's the embedded quotations. And, as before, the development of your initial points about the adult's feelings. So, grab your pen and get writing. The text will reappear in 5-second intervals and you can toggle between them, pressing pause now. Here's what I wrote. Both these extracts show clear tension between adults. In Anita and Me, incredulity at seemingly being shunned is shown by Deirdre towards Mina's mother, who chooses to maintain an appearance of cordiality in spite of the fact that she loathes the fact Deirdre chose to give her dog a disgustingly racist name. Meanwhile, in Stoner, Lomax openly shows hostility towards Stoner, who seems taken aback and defeated by the strength of his colleague's feelings. In Anita and Me, Deirdre feels indignant and disbelieving that Dalgett is apparently preventing their daughters from socializing together, as shown in her aggrieved question, "'Cause we ain't good enough for you lot, is that it?" Her disbelief stems from her prejudicial, stereotypical view that those from an ethnic background are likely to be barely literate, lost and already defeated, or confused, helpless innocents, and therefore implicitly inferior to herself and her family. She clearly feels puzzled by the concept of an Asian family being more successful and calmly settled than her own, and doesn't quite know how to react. Whereas Deirdre uses dialect and struggles to explain or expand upon her feelings, Lomax in Stoner is far more explicit and articulate when it comes to censuring his colleague. He unequivocally condemns his colleague's actions in nearly ruining the career of a student with an unfortunate affliction that would have called forth sympathy in a normal human being. The tone is initially vicious and emotional, as confirmed in adverbs such as bitterly and passionately, whilst the use of the adjective normal in this context clearly suggests that he feels Stoner was abnormally and unacceptably inhumane in his failure to take account of the student's disability. His eloquence contrasts with Deirdre's stuttered indignation, although in both texts the other adults respond defensively. In Anita and Me, Dalgett's defensiveness is seen in her polite request for Deirdre to explain why she would have prevented their daughters from seeing each other. "Now why should I want to do that, Mrs. Rutter?" Whereas Deirdre uses contractions such as "cuz" and "ain't," Dalgett fails to contract any of her words and maintains a higher level of public courtesy in the use of Deirdre's surname, Mrs. Rutter. This implicitly confirms her position as an adult in control with a superior social status, in spite of her ethnicity. Both Stoner and Dalgett attempt to calm down the other adults in these exchanges, but whereas Dalgett is successful, Stoner fails miserably, in spite of the reasonableness and eloquence of his arguments. He points out that historically they have got along and that there's no need to display their differences in public. However, his loss of control over the exchange is confirmed in descriptions of his reactions. He listens almost with horror to Lomax's words and ends up tiredly conceding the fact that the two will henceforth be enemies forever. The adverb tiredly confirms his numb acceptance of a conflict he never wanted, whilst the noun horror gives an insight into his feelings towards Lomax at this point. He is shocked at the intensity of his colleague's reaction and the way that it has resulted in him making cruel, terrifyingly broad-ranging judgments about himself as a person and a professional. I don't think you're fit to be a teacher. Some insight is given into why Deirdre may be accosting Daljet in Anita and Me. The narrator declares that she had been seeking approval all her life in this village, thus suggesting that her questions to Mina's mother have stemmed from deeply held insecurity or some kind of inferiority complex. In Stoner, the narrator does not include any explicit explanations about Lomax's motivations, although the reader, like Stoner, is likely to be taken aback by the vehemence of his hatred, as seen in declarations such as "We have never been friends," which interrupts his colleagues' seemingly calm and rational attempts at reconciliation. His statements are incredibly and unusually direct and hurtful, and include, "I want to have nothing to do with you. Nothing at all." There is no attempt to soften or disguise his feelings of scorn and hatred. The first sentence is structured as a simple sentence, whilst the grammatically incomplete "nothing at all" repeats nothing from the previous sentence and makes it abundantly clear that Lomax will not be prepared to engage on any level with Stoner. The reader is likely to feel that such a reaction is disproportionate and may well be stemming from some kind of personal insecurity which may not be so dissimilar to that shown by Deirdre in Anita and Me. To conclude, these two extracts show adults struggling to understand each other in very different contexts. In Anita and Me, the lack of understanding stems partly from ignorance and racial prejudice, whereas in Stoner, one man's withering, blistering attack on another colleague seems extraordinarily personal and virulent. There are no explicit explanations given as why one colleague has chosen to launch such a character assassination, or whether such claims may be justified. How does this response achieve full marks? Well, it starts with a clear, short introduction, which makes it abundantly clear that I am answering the question. Make sure you don't fall into the trap of introducing the question without actually showing the examiner you have already begun to assimilate the key ideas from the text. And what are the first main paragraph? Well, note the clear structure. Firstly, a clear, detailed point about adult feelings in one of the texts, followed by a relatively short quotation. I don't want to waste time copying. But it is perhaps from the third sentence that I begin to access the higher marks by developing my initial point further. Why does Deirdre feel indignant and disbelieving? It is because of her feelings of prejudice, and I back this up with further deliciously short embedded quotations. In terms of the mark scheme, this extract on screen ticks numerous boxes. Precise, interwoven, textual references or quotations. There is the perceptive and sensitive understanding of the context, partly gleaned from the passage and partly from my understanding of the attitudes towards different ethnicities presented in the novel as a whole. And there is the consistently perceptive, detailed understanding of the text. I don't just make a simple point about adult feelings before moving on. I probe these feelings in detail. I explore, I explain. As the paragraph goes on, note how I make a very specific comparison between the two texts. I don't just plonk one after the other and think, hooray, I'm comparing. I compare the comparative reticence of Deirdre in Anita and Me with the terrifying eloquence of Lomax in Stoner. But notice how I make another comparison towards the end of this paragraph. This is needed so that I can convince the examiner that my comparisons are sustained and interwoven. The best responses will probe language and individual words in penetrating detail. And this is something I try to do when exploring Lomax's tone and the use of the adjective normal. And as I do this, I aim to be precise and technical with my use of subject terminology. I've used the terms dialect, adverbs, and adjective correctly. Now for my to the point concluding tips, and the first is about the importance of using plenty of short embedded quotations in order to show a detailed understanding of the passages. Explore these quotations in detail, picking out individual words and exploring their meaning and effects. Thirdly, if a simile has been used, say it. If personification has been used, say it. Don't just write this suggests, but say this adjective suggests. Don't make a big fuss about knowing that a metaphor is a metaphor. This shouldn't take up an entire sentence. Instead, get on with exploring what the effect of the image is. Next, make sure that your analysis is well written, but interesting to read. And of course, you need to compare throughout. Your comparisons need to be interwoven. Whilst you do need to ensure that you go into plenty of detail when explaining individual points from each text, you also need to keep the other text in mind. Oh, have you watched this video yet? Clearly, a student getting a grade 9 will know the text as a whole extremely well, and so that particular video shown on screen will be invaluable in that respect.
This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare guide to Anita and Me, the comparison question for GCSE English Literature. Many thanks for watching.